Hello and welcome to the Antifada, where unrest is best. I'm Jamie Peck.
I'm Andy.
And we are here with an awesome guest today. He is the co-founder of Novara Media and author of Fully Automated Luxury Communism. His name is Aaron Bastani. Hey, Aaron, what's up?
Hey, what's up? Thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much for coming.
Aaron, we're sorry you couldn't be in studio today. You're in London, is that correct?
That's not correct. Actually, I'm on the south coast. I'll be in London tomorrow.
You're in Brighton.
I'm not in Brighton. I'm in a place called Portsmouth.
Okay, those are the two cities I know.
Right now.
So, let me ask you this. Do you recognize this voice?
Silence.
I suppose not.
Okay. You interviewed me many years ago at the Social Bloom occupation.
Oh, wow.
About Occupy Wall Street.
Go on.
And it wasn't Novara, but it was basically the product you were doing before Novara, as far as I can tell.
Yeah. I remember we chatted in the upstairs room, didn't we?
I don't remember what level we talked on.
Yeah, I think so.
Besides the deeply intellectual level of the conversation, of course.
Andy loves to blindside people with these trick questions about how they met. It's amazing.
Well, I met Rona at the same occupation.
Tell me more. Where was this occupation?
It was a occupied, like the Chinese, the Oriental Studies building that had like a lot of Chinese artifacts.
Yeah, it was crazy, actually. There was loads of really valuable stuff there, like silk prints from like the 18th century and stuff, yeah.
Nice.
Well, not loads, like several.
And what was this occupation about?
Very similar stuff to what was going on in the US a couple of years earlier, particularly on the West Coast, but yeah, across the US. Basic stuff, marketization, student debt, the neoliberal university, outsourcing, privatization, precarity for students and workers alike. I'm sure your listeners are quite familiar with it. But it ended quite violently because actually we were evicted. I mean, we were living there. We were squatting there effectively. And I recall we were evicted maybe 3 or 4 days before Christmas. And I woke up about 6 o'clock in the morning with guys coming through the roof, through the ceiling, in fact, with balaclavas and sledgehammers.
Oh, geez.
So, yeah, it's quite a traumatic period of my life.
Well,
However, it was great meeting you.
You too.
It sounds like you were in some very lush surroundings. I don't know if it's a good segue to talking about luxury communism. How were all the artifacts at the end of that? Did they survive?
Yeah, they did. I mean, in retrospect, we possibly should have nicked a few, but no, everything was fine. I mean, it wasn't like, it wasn't kitted out, but I recall a few sort of Japanese silk prints up on the walls that maybe we should have taken.
We should have taken Jeremy Bentham's corpse.
Yeah, I mean, that would have created a great furore. We should have done precisely that. That's
UCL,
one of the weirdest
right?
things, actually, about like London universities.
All the corpses?
Well, yeah, just Jeremy Bentham's corpse being like publicly visible. It's kind of odd.
Doesn't he sit at
that is
like
weird.
He's like at the board meetings and he's like supposedly a vote or something?
Apparently, yeah. I don't know if that's true or not, but apparently.
That rules.
They should keep the corpses in the downstairs jerk-off basement like we do in America.
They actually, if your listeners sort of Google Jeremy Bentham head, because the head is like it's the most screwed. I don't know if I can swear, so I'll just kind of I'll rein it in. I can swear it's kind of the most fucked up thing I've ever seen face to face. It's like something from a horror movie, and it was on public display. I mean, why would you do this? Quite bizarre.
Well, they worked for Lenin, so can't argue with that.
That's true, yeah, but I think the Lenin preservation thing actually worked. If you look at, I mean, Jeremy Bentham died a little bit before, so it kind of, I don't think his embalming was as successful as Lenin's.
Well, being a goth socialist podcast, this is something that we're going to prioritize into the future so that we can see the skeletons of all of our leaders just right there hanging out for all eternity.
Well, you see, I think fully automated luxury communism would be more interested in just reversing the aging process. So we all live forever. But
will it bring back all the dead of history?
No, sadly not.
You're not an immortalist.
I'm not Ray Kurzweil, who is, engaged in longevity studies in order to bring back my dead father, which apparently is why he does it, which is, again, quite strange given the responsibility he has at Google.
I didn't know that. That's really sad. So let's talk about something more cheerful. We are going to record this we're recording this on the 8th. We're probably releasing in about 10 days. So anything you want to say about what's going on in Parliament with Brexit and Bojo and the Absolute Boy might be a little bit dated. But why don't you just talk as if it's 10 days in the future, the glorious 10 days, and tell me what you hope will happen.
Well, it is very difficult to say because 10 days ago, where we are now would have seemed, highly unlikely. We've had effectively 10 days, 2 weeks of protests. Of course, Johnson tried to prorogue Parliament 2 weeks ago, which kind of which catalyzed this response. And for your listeners, proroguing is effectively he was using powers that are normally invested in the monarch to suspend Parliament. Now, Parliament has something called recess, where it can dissolve itself for holidays, for conferences, or it can be prorogued, where it's suspended, but not suspended by itself, suspended by the monarch.
We have something like that in the U.S. It's called Joe Roganing.
Tell me how that works.
It's a trip, man. It's a lot cooler than what you're talking about.
Hey, I liked his interview with Bernie Sanders. That was quite good.
A little quiet for me, but it's good that 10 million people have seen it.
Did the ultra left jump on that? Like, oh my God, Bernie's sold out. He's now with this alt-right. I mean, I completely get that Joe Rogan's alt-right adjacent, but like, how did that go down with like the ultra left?
I honestly think that position was probably in the minority. Like, good. Most of the people who I know on the left want Bernie to win. And in order to do that, he's going to need to reach a new audience. And the media is so fucking polarized. Like, nobody trusts anything outside of their echo chamber. And Joe Rogan is one of the few platforms that is seen as neutral somehow, even if he's not. So, like, the downwardly mobile white millennial dudes who listen to his show and maybe are flirting with a kind of weed-addled libertarianism or whatever, who'd never listened to Bernie talk before, they're all of a sudden saying, oh, yeah, he's actually got some good things to say. He seems like he's going to help us out. So, like, most of the people who I know were all about that.
That's really good to hear. I mean, the numbers are crazy, right, for that show. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's insane. It's crazy, man. Dude.
Well, we got to get you on there, but sorry to interrupt with this. We have a lot of Joe Rogan side talk on this show.
He's very influential in our field. It's really
he's huge.
In the room.
Look, he had the interview with Bernie. He had the interview with Elon Musk. He had the interview with Alex Jones. He had the interview with Milo. Like, these are all kind of people who look back on that stuff in like 30 years and go, wow, that was really that was a really fucked up period.
Yeah, he also had on Cornel West, which was awesome.
Yeah.
But he's got to have on Jake Flores and Aaron Bastani.
and us.
Me. Yeah, and me.
Well, I'm sure all things in good time.
I mean, he's already had on my Black Swan, Barry Weiss, so I figure it's only a matter of time for me.
So let's try to. I'm anxious to hear your Brexit prediction. So you were talking about the proroguing. I think that gets us into like, I don't know. It seems so long ago now. But keep going. Yeah.
So what you guys maybe don't necessarily understand, because our constitution is really, really strange. It's basically a series of gentlemen's agreements from the 15th century. And obviously the problem is when you have somebody who doesn't want to play by the rules, or the conventions rather, like Boris Johnson, that creates problems. So the prime minister, the executive, the government in the US, it would be the presidency, the executive, is invested with a bunch of powers we call raw prerogative powers. So technically, really, they are the powers you'd associate with a monarch. It gives them extraordinary power. And because the counterbalance of the monarch themselves is purely ceremonial, when they want to take the mickey, if Boris Johnson wants to create new bank holidays, if he wants to, create 30 new lords, if he wants to pick certain bishops, if he wants to declare war, technically you don't really need an act of parliament to do that. So there's an extraordinary amount of power invested in the person of the prime minister. He's abusing that. He tried to prorogue parliament, to suspend it in order to help get through or take us closer to a no deal. The reason being he wanted to basically put a gun to the head of MPs so they would vote for his withdrawal agreement. And that backfired. And then 21 Tory MPs, basically his first day in Parliament, he had a majority of one, a very small majority, but a majority. On his first day in Parliament, he lost 3 votes Bear in mind, it took Thatcher 11 years to lose 4 votes. It took Tony Blair 10 years to lose 4 votes. So Boris Johnson lost 3 in his first day. And he had 21 of his Tory colleagues lose the whip, which means they're no longer technically Tory MPs because they didn't vote with the government. A day later, Philip Lee, another Tory MP, crossed the floor to join the Liberal Democrats. So he's basically gone from a majority of 1 to a deficit of 43, which now means they can get no legislation through. So effectively, the Tories aren't really the government anymore. And if the Liberal Democrats, one of the minor opposition parties, were willing to back Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister, he'd probably have a majority to form an interim government, call a general election, suspend Article 50. But they won't do that. So at the moment, it's kind of like a Mexican standoff. But, the Liberal Democrats, despite only having 17 MPs, actually have a disproportionate amount of influence in what happens next.
I'm going to be honest, I do not understand anything that's going on with Brexit, but I hope that was enlightening to our listeners.
I listened to a lot of Novara on this subject, and so I do understand most of what you said, but there is a point in these Novara episodes that my mind just goes somewhere else, and I have to go back and listen again. Especially when you start talking about what happened in the 16th century that led to the kind of gentleman's agreement that is now being broken or whatever.
It's crazy. We don't have we don't have a constitution. It's crazy. We don't have any rights. We leave the EU. If we leave and the EU has a bunch of sort of legal institutions attached to it. Some technically, some informally, but this is what the Tories want to do. They want to pull us out of the European Courts of Justice, the European Human Rights Act. EHRC actually it's called, which is embodied in British law. They want to pull us out of all of that, and so it starts to look quite ropey. The idea that Britain is a modern 21st century democratic state is there's an edifice there, and a big part of that edifice collapses if we leave the European Union and leave those institutions.
I was just listening to Tisky Sour today, one of the excellent shows on Novara Media, and there's something about some legislation is going to hit the House of Lords, and the House of Lords is going to is probably going to knock it down.
There was a proposal put down an amendment put down by Stephen Kinnock, who's a Labour backbencher. It was Labour MPs who basically want to vote for some kind of deal because they're in Leave seats. And the tellers, each side has to have a teller. These are the people that, determine how many votes have been for each side. The government didn't provide a teller. Therefore, the amendment automatically goes through. But because it's an amendment, the Lords can automatically vote it down. And look, this makes no sense to you. It makes no sense to me. And that's a problem. That's a problem for socialists because obviously the British parliamentary system is almost intentionally designed to make it obscure and completely incomprehensible. Because, of course, how can you democratize and challenge a system which you don't understand? So, it lends itself to creating this class of technocrats and esoteric kind of, criminologists, but just for Westminster. And yeah, for most people, you're working 48 hours a week, you got your kids, you got a small business, or you're working minimum wage or whatever. Jesus, you need like a PhD. Even people with PhDs in political science don't understand this. So yeah, it's arcane for a reason, I think.
Mm-hmm.
What about the sword? What's the deal with that?
You mean the mace?
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry. My bad.
There's probably a sword.
Shows how much I know.
The sword's in the stone, and hopefully Jeremy Corbyn can pull it out.
The mace. We had a revolution in Britain about 140 years before you guys did, but because it took place in the context of a sort of religious schism, it wasn't necessarily a revolution. It was a civil war. But there was an uprising which ultimately led to the execution of the king in Whitehall, Charles I. We had a kind of republic. Obviously, nobody really knew what a republic was like, so we called it a commonwealth, and it didn't really have much democracy. Although there were certain groups in the Civil War, the Levellers, the Diggers, the Ranters, who were all various sort of proto-communist or radical democratic factions within the Parliamentary Army. Very, very interesting time. Let's go through all that. Kind of irrelevant. What it meant was that Parliament had sovereignty and that Parliament could act without the complete oversight of the King. And so even today, when the Queen goes to open Parliament every year, the Queen's speech is basically when the government outlines their agenda, for the year ahead, the laws they want to pass, the chamber in which the monarch gets sort of robed above where they sit is the death warrant for Charles I. As they walk into Parliament, there's somebody called Black Rod. They say to Black Rod, "Can I come in?" They have to have permission from MPs to even enter the Houses of Parliament.
What are they, vampires?
So if you want to understand this whole bizarre hybrid we have, kind of democratic, kind of not, you have to sort of understand the politics of the mid-17th century. So that's where the mace comes in.
Or read J.K. Rowling, I guess.
Yes, or read J.K. Rowling. I actually think, probably, to be honest, the English Civil War is a lot more interesting than J.K. Rowling, but we're still awaiting for a good Netflix series on it.
Well, it really does tickle my Gothic sensibilities, so you got me there.
Yeah, I think once we have a Labour government and we can sort of, we take over the BBC, I want somebody to write, this is the great thing, because imagining socialists having control of Netflix in the United States.
Hell yeah.
So we could create like a 10-part series about the levelers. We'd get Tom Hardy as honest John Lilburn. We could make a series about the Haitian Revolution, get Idris Elba as Toussaint Louverture. These are all the things we could do with the Labour government. Very exciting.
That does sound good. So speaking of the exciting possibilities of the future, let's talk about your book. Fully Automated Luxury Communism is, I'd say, best known as a meme that's been going around the old internet for a while. I think sometimes we see it as fully automated gay space luxury communism or some variation thereof.
And I have done some research on this meme for the book that I'm writing about the Posadist movement. And as far as I can tell, you invented this meme. Is that correct?
Those words in that sequence, yeah. I'm going to take responsibility for it.
Nice.
Wow.
No, your meme did not fail me this time.
Yeah, I think so. Although the idea of luxury communism, that can be traced back to kind of like German autonomen movements in the early 2000s. So,
got to give credit where credit's due. So, what is fully automated luxury communism? Let's just start with a really basic question.
Fully automated luxury communism, I think, builds on a certain vanilla orthodox understanding of Karl Marx. Karl Marx viewed socialism and communism as two separate things. He understood socialism as growing out of capitalism in so much as you change the relations of workers to the means of production. But it was, however, not a new mode of production. So a mode of production can be found, say, in feudalism. A mode of production can be found in capitalism. A mode of production can be found in communism. So socialism for him was about changing relationships to means of production. Communism was a new mode of production. So just as capitalism is different to feudalism, he suspected, or he claimed, that communism would be different to capitalism. Different social relations, different technologies, different relationships to nature, different forms of daily life. And fully automated luxury communism effectively makes a very, I think, a quite sensible case, really. It looks at the crises that are defining the 21st century: demographic aging, automation, climate change, breakdown of our economic model. And it says that market capitalism probably can't survive these. These are probably existential. It then looks at the emergence of a range of technologies which attenuate or undermine key characteristics of the capitalist market economy through the price mechanism, elsewhere with regards to AI, robotics, and what that can do for the extent to which workers can demand payment for their labor, whether it's renewable energy and creating deflationary trends in regards to the price that energy can command. And then finally, it looks at how we can have a political project which latches onto these technological possibilities, and rather than subordinating them to the interests of the ruling class to profit, how they can help us engage with the problems outlined in the first third of the book: demographic aging, climate change, inequality, but also how we can move to that new mode of production. So it's effectively saying we have a political project, we change capitalism to a socialist economy, and eventually we'll move to something like communism, because principally technologies like AI and robotics start to really attenuate some of the features that Marx viewed as inherent within capitalism or even within socialism. So capitalism is defined by selling your labor for a wage. It's also defined by production for profit, or what he called exchange value. In socialism, you still have scarcity like you do in capitalism. You still have to work. It's just that the value you create through your work is not alienated. In communism, he says, and this is in Capital Volume 3, he says that the sort of distinctions between mental and physical work disintegrate. He says that the distinction between work and play end, and that you achieve a measure of post-scarcity. So communism for Marx is quite distinct from socialism. And so the book is really looking at that as the end point and saying, well, in the next 50 to 100 years, in the meantime, what's the politics that we can practically engage with, but also take us to that end destination, or rather that beginning, because we shouldn't view communism as the end of history, but rather the beginning of real, meaningful human history.
Hell yeah. That reminds me a lot of what we read about and talked about in our Gilles Devey episode on communization theory, where the distinction between work activities and other activities kind of collapses. And, somehow we find fulfillment through striving for, the greater good, survival, happiness, and manage to grow potatoes in the process.
Yeah, but one thing I really like about FALC, as I think we can call it from now on, FALC, and we'll have some more like critical questions later on in the episode.
Of course.
But it's a rejection or an imminent critique of the very bourgeois futurisms of people like Elon Musk, which we'll get into. Mm-hmm. And also it's trying to reimagine communism not as this very austere thing, which is, when Devey talks about it, like Jamie said, he's talking about like, oh, you're going to be able to have all these delicious potatoes. And like, that's not necessarily the most inspiring thing to people to farm potatoes. So I remember, I don't know if you made it, but there was a FALC meme where the Grim Reaper is just going door to door, and one of the doors is anarcho-primitivism. And that really was a very big tendency in the 2000s and late 90s. And people don't really talk about it the same way anymore. They're still interested in environmentalism and direct action, and but it's no longer the ideal that it once was. And I think these kinds of reimaginations of how good life can be if we seize the world for ourselves is very refreshing for that reason.
Yeah, going back to the Devey stuff, and I think Gilles Devey and that tendency is really, really useful. I think their critique of liberalism is very powerful. I think their understanding of 20th century, or a lot of their understanding of 20th century socialism is very powerful. One of the things I would disagree with them, and I think that's obvious from the book, is that I think that their fetish for insurrection, and there's nothing wrong with insurrection in certain contexts, obviously, but there's a certain fetish there for insurrection, for riot, for ecological collapse, which could all happen. Ecological collapse is happening. It's going to happen unless we do something quite dramatic. But I think there's a certain fetish for that, which they use as a substitute for revolution. So, there's a revolution because we'll have the non-reproduction of capitalist social relations, because there'll be a permanent, insurrection and rioting and death, and you see that in the aesthetics, for instance, of ruin porn. In the sort of just after the crisis of 2008-9. 2007-8 really, but which sort of heralded the beginning of the Great Recession after the collapse of Lehman Brothers, etc. There was this aesthetics all of a sudden around rioting and around ruins, and I think generally speaking that spoke to the lack of a North Star for people on the left. And so that's where I kind of and I view the sort of Devey stuff as really not having a formidable expression of revolution or revolutionary imagination in the 21st century, because all they can imagine in stopping capitalism is its non-reproduction rather than something else.
What, you don't find 100 years of primitive surgery to be an inspiring vision for the future?
Well, 100 years of primitive surgery, what's this? I don't think I'm familiar with this.
That's kind of an inside joke.
Wait, who was it who said that?
It was we went to a SICK conference in Marseille many years ago.
Oh, wow!
And one of the communist theorizers.
I love
said,
those guys. Yeah, I had their first journal. What happened to them?
I do not know what happened to them. I think they're still doing something. But yeah, they said something that like the first 100 years after the revolution is going to be misery, including primitive surgery, which means Civil War era surgery without anesthetics and that sort of thing.
Cool, sign me up.
But also, that's just not. See, this is what I just don't think that's true. Like, so let's say we get a world even of 6 degrees warming, right? In a world of 6 degrees, and that's obviously hundreds of years, could be thousands of years away. The Earth is 5 billion years old. The margin of error is obviously very big. But let's say it's a couple of hundred years away. World 6 degrees warmer than today, too much methane in the atmosphere for things to breathe. You're definitely, if you're based in most of the United States, you ain't going to be able to do much agriculture. Same for Southern Europe. Really the only places you can do large-scale agriculture is the North and South Poles. We're still going to have very wealthy people getting away with things. We're still going to have exploitation. We're still going to have the ultra-rich being fine. And, I talk about it in the book. The film Elysium is a great example of that. To the extent that they literally create an off-world colony. What's the logical conclusion for gated communities? So I don't buy the idea that we are all equally affected by the collapse of environmental systems or capitalism. Well, we're clearly not, because it's already begun. And, the very wealthiest people in Greece, they're generally doing much better than the poorest, right? So that's where I see a sort of lacuna in their thinking about 100 years of primitive surgery.
Well, it's nice to know that you're on the side of Matt Damon in his quest to ruin Jodie Foster's beautiful lesbian planet.
I am, sadly.
So before we get into more theoretical, fun questions, I think let's bring it back to another concept that's important in your book, and that is the third disruption. So you talk about how there have been two already, and we're now living through a third one that's going to be a total paradigm shift in how humans live. So what's the third disruption, and why is it important to us?
Yeah, so I've chosen the word disruption because I want to appeal to Silicon Valley douchebags before your audience kind of smirk at my choice of words. I'm a historical materialist. I'm a Marxist. So what does that mean in terms of disruptions? It means that human history isn't just a series of sort of accidental events, nor is human consciousness, how we organize society, detached from technologies or geology, climate systems, etc. So the first disruption is about 12,000 years ago. It's the first sort of technological revolution. There have been humans with the similar brains to us as you and I for about 200,000 years. Yet they're not really doing very much until about 12,000 years ago. And that's because of the arrival of a bunch of technologies, or the generation of a bunch of technologies, farming, agriculture. We understand how to breed in and out certain characteristics for flora and fauna. That is known generally as, that's not a contentious point. That's known as the agricultural or the Neolithic revolution. That change in what Marx would call the technological base permits the new superstructure of cities, language, culture, mathematics, legal systems, complex societies, slavery, you name it. And about 12,000 years ago, the global human population was around 5 million people, the population of Ireland today. By 1800, it gets to 1 billion. So clearly that new technological paradigm allows us to sustain far larger populations of human beings. Second disruption is early 19th century, really the late 18th century. And it's based around the technologies of the steam engine and fossil fuels really coming together. Steam engine's been around for a long time. It existed before then. But what Bolton steam engine turns it into the backbone of the Industrial Revolution. And I talk again about how that change in technology creates new mental conceptions, new forms of identity, new forms of global togetherness, or actually in many instances, non-togetherness, new relationships to nature. And of course, it massively impacts our climate system. So if we're talking about the Anthropocene or the Capitalocene, which is really the idea that a geological era begins where humans become the primary catalyst in changing climate systems, it's around the 17th, 18th century. So again, I think there's lots of data sort of back that up as a big historic shift. And then the third disruption, just as the second was kind of twinned around steam power and then electricity and fossil fuels, the third disruption is AI, general purpose robotics, coupled with renewable forms of energy, which would create as big a shift in economic and technological possibilities as the second one did. So I argue that there's a different mental landscape for us to imagine a socially just politics, given those changes in the technological base over the last 50, 60 years, which is how old these technologies are. They're not science fiction. The first photovoltaic cell is used by NASA, actually. Well, it's not NASA. I think was it NASA at the time? Yes, it is. With the Vanguard 1 or 2 satellite, Transistors have been around a long time. Lithium-ion batteries have been around a long time. So these technologies have been here for a long time. But just as with the steam engine, Newcomen's steam engine was in the 1710s. Watt's steam engine is the 1780s, 1790s. Something similar is happening with these technologies. So in the next 10 to 20 years, they'll increasingly find themselves in the Internet of Things, highly, highly capable computers, increased automation of everyday life, of many jobs, first through deeper machine learning, eventually with the arrival of a general artificial intelligence, is plural. That's the third disruption. And you're right, it's kind of it demurs from very strange capitalist realist articulations of contemporary technology by, the Silicon Valley ideologues, etc.
Well, how I understood it, and this is, maybe an oversimplification, but the third disruption is just the incredible concentration and distribution and ability to process information, especially with the, exponential expansion of smallness and speed of digital technology.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, for many things, the primary thing about it is information becoming an increasingly central factor of production. And again, that's one of these throwaway lines from kind of capitalist ideologues over the last 10 to 20 years. But I try to put that in perspective and explain what it means. A great example already is pharmaceuticals. In pharmaceuticals, the value of pharmaceutical drugs, huge industry, is not coming from the labor. It's not coming from the land. It's coming from the information. How do the capitalist class ensure that they can retain profits from it? Well, it's enforced scarcity. And the increased centrality of information as a factor of production will mean that more and more of the economy looks like that. But yeah, in addition to that, renewable energy is clearly a major part as well, because information can be incredibly cheap. But for now, we have transportation systems. We need to keep warm. We need lighting, etc. The sort of missing chain in the missing link in the chain, rather. So you've got energy and you've got information potentially being getting ever closer to zero. I actually think that's inevitable. Then somebody has the rejoinder, well, resources aren't infinite, right? Land isn't infinite, which is a very good point. We'll never have infinite land. Although the Economist magazine, actually talking about fully automated luxury communism, if you Google Economists, fully automated luxury communism, they talked about space exploration as meaning that we have post-scarcity in land. I'd put that to one side. We may be able to extract significantly more minerals than we presently do once we start to look at mineral resources beyond our own planet. Again, I'm not saying that's happening tomorrow, but you only need to look at the agenda of the ruling class, the creation of legal frameworks for space exploration and resource extraction. Luxembourg's providing legal frameworks for it. We have businesses engaging in this. Barack Obama signed something called the Space Act in 2015. Japan has already sent 2 landers to asteroids and they've come back. China's doing something similar. The US is looking to go to an asteroid next year with NASA. So this is in train. And so if that is a plausible enterprise, resource extraction from beyond our planet, then you're looking really at ever cheaper energy, labor because of automation, the plummeting cost of information and resources. And so that creates a new context, I think, for, again, how do you construct a radical left politics in the 21st century?
Yeah, I like your the essay you wrote responding to Elon Musk's plan of mining asteroids, which was that when space landed in the FALC term, fully automated space communism? Is that when it first arose?
I have no idea. I think clearly asteroid, high power robotics and deep machine learning and deep learning is already here. Clearly solar is dropping in price all the time, so that's already here. So people latch onto the kind of weirder, more zany stuff, which clearly asteroid mining is. So I think that's probably when it did happen. Yeah.
So the point that you make that I really like is that, okay, so say Musk is able to do this thing, which, people, especially like in Reddit type of communities, like nerds who love NASA, they love the idea of exploring space. Not just nerds, but just, it's a vision of the future that really unites people. And it's sort of been co-opted by Musk and SpaceX and entrepreneurialism in Silicon Valley. Yep. And so when he has this idea of like, well, we can just send drones to mine asteroids and get all these minerals, and we know, like all the misery caused on Earth by all this mining. And you respond, well, if you're going to make a profit off that, then you're going to have to keep the supply of what you mine artificially low in order to keep it marketable. And you say it just doesn't make any sense. Like if we have this technology, we should just use it to abolish mining on Earth, right?
Yeah, that's exactly. I mean, so obviously, in the words of Peter Diamandis, I think is one of the people sort of around this area, he said, in terms of resources on our planet, we need to understand that we presently are sitting on a crumb in the middle of a supermarket, right? Which is how we should understand the solar system. Now, the idea that we can go beyond our solar system with any even technologies anytime soon, highly unlikely. But automated landers going to near-Earth asteroids and returning with resources. Technically, it was achieved by the Japanese with something called the Hayabusa lander. So we can already do it. The question is, how cheap can you make it and what are the returns you can get? Now, let's say that can happen. Let's say the returns can be very high. The last thing you want to do if you're selling a product is by saturating the market with massive oversupply. And there is such a huge concentration of mineral resources in our solar system. That's precisely what they would do. So their incentives for, accessing this wealth and giving it to us would be very similar to pharmaceutical drugs. We right now, everybody in the United States could access very cheap insulin, ultra cheap insulin. But the point is that's not the case because people in some places need to make money off other people. And it would be a very similar dynamic with regards to mineral resources, So yeah, the exact same sort of imposition of scarcity would define that sort of commercial relationship too.
So the way you talk about the resources available in space, they sound kind of infinite, but the number of asteroids is finite. So what happens when we run out of asteroids to mine?
Yeah, well, it's a very interesting question, but we are looking at huge amounts of resources, huge. If you look, I think it's called, the asteroid in question is called Psyche 16, and this is the one and it's actually a planetoid. It's a small planet. The larger an asteroid, because of course of how gravitation works, they start to become perfectly spherical, like a planet. Psyche 16 is a planet. It has quadrillions of dollars worth of iron, quadrillions of dollars. So we can't really, it's very hard for us to understand the resources available to us. And I mean, technically, yes, they're not infinite, but I mean, it's as close to infinite as the material universe is ever going to get. So I don't know, maybe that'd be a question for sort of several thousand years time. But, one estimate says that if you get all the mineral resources amongst near-Earth asteroids and you divide them equally amongst every person on the face of the Earth, each person would have access to around $200 billion worth of mineral resources. So this is all in the book. It's all cited. So, technically that's true, but I don't think it'd be a practical problem for a long time yet.
So shifting gears a little bit, you had an article in the New York Times this summer where you talked a lot about the Impossible Burger and other kind of plant-based meats as a solution to one of the major environmental crises, which is factory farming, the immense amount of cattle and livestock in the world, which, that themselves create methane. And also a lot of the rainforest is being burnt down for to sustain them as livestock and also to grow soy to feed them. Mm-hmm. And you see things like the Impossible Burger, this plant-based meat, as something of a solution to that. And since you wrote that article, here in New York, we've got, and I'm a vegetarian and I love fake meat, so this is very big for me. We've got the Impossible Whopper at Burger King. We have a bacon, egg, and cheese McMuffin kind of thing at Dunkin' Donuts. And soon I think we're going to have plant-based meatball subs at Subway.
Wow. Are they tasty? Because I've never actually had an Impossible Burger.
The Impossible... I do like the Impossible Burger at White Castle. At Burger King, it's a little bit too big and salty for me.
Right.
But the White Castle is a really nice size. And the Dunkin' Donuts Beyond sausage thing I do really like. But, we're not trying to buzz market fast food chains here on the show. I guess my serious question is, now that all these fast food chains have these plant-based options, are we one step closer to fully automated luxury vegetarian communism? Yeah,
I think that the technology has a major role to play. So I think in the US, the average person eats around 3,500, 800 calories a day. Clearly, you have very high per capita meat consumption compared to the rest of the world. If the whole world, now let's just adopt the ideology of sort of the elites of the United States. We want the whole world to have the same standard of living as a citizen of the US, purely in terms of agricultural production that would be necessary. That's not possible. We would need about another 5 planet Earths if everybody on Earth ate like the average American. And that's not just because of how much they eat, but it's because of that intensity of the amount of meat they eat. So if everybody ate the same amount of meat and calories as the average American, the world could feed with its biocapacity about 2.5 billion people. If everybody ate a similar diet to South Asia, you're looking at about, with obviously far less meat or negligible meat, very little dairy, no eggs, you're looking at about 10 billion people. So the extent to which we eat animal products is massive. If you look at, for instance, land and water use for meat, it's huge. Most of the crops we grow as a species are to feed to other animals, which we then eat. I mean, it's obvious when you think about it, but and by a huge factor as well, right? It's not 2 or 3 times. It's a huge factor. Again, it's in the book. I think in the US, the numbers I've seen, it could be 10 times more, crops, or 10 times more. Yeah. Crops are being used to feed meat than are then given over to humans. Maybe you guys happen to import more vegetables and fruit from Mexico, possibly. I mean, things like avocados and stuff. I'm sure you just import that stuff, but that's generally how it works. In terms of land and water, we can't eat like we presently do. So even if you don't have a radical sort of political perspective on this, even if you're not a socialist, these technologies are absolutely critical. What I would say is that their adoption, particularly in the global south, won't be quick enough to mitigate. We need to completely transform our economies away from fossil fuels globally speaking, within 30 years. In the meantime, we need to be rewilding. How can you rewild if global meat production is going up? That can't happen. So we need to massively reduce the amount of meat we're eating now. And this stuff within a market mechanism, with Impossible Burger, at Burger King, that's great for some people in the global north, but we need to make it a kind of mainstay of global food production, because places like China, South Asia, I mean, China, Chinese demand for milk, for instance, in the next couple of decades is going to double or triple. Sub-Saharan Africa's population is going to double by 2050, could quadruple by 2100. At the same time, per capita meat or milk or egg consumption is going up. So it needs to really be front and center of that conversation about the global food market. And somebody at Impossible Burger will say, well, the global meat market, I think it's $1 trillion global market. They'll be going great, and in a way, fantastic. Fantastic that quote unquote innovators are meeting that demand. But I would argue that in order to roll it out more quickly and to create more socially just outcomes, you do need at least a minimal in the interim period, in the sort of radical social democratic vision, which is viewed as the bridge to fully automated luxury communism. There's certainly a role to play for the state. Like in Britain, for instance, there's an argument about free school meals for every kid, right? It's not a universal policy anymore. It kind of used to be. Labour at the last election fought on a platform of free school meals for all children. I would say that's a great opportunity to use cellular agriculture, synthetic meats, right? There should be no meat in providing these kids free school meals. Great example, right? Or with the NHS, they procure meals, feeding lots of people. The same could apply through, or universities, etc. So these public anchor institutions could play a very important role in transitioning our eating habits very, very quickly. But that would necessitate a sort of measure of state intervention that we're a bit more familiar with it here in the UK, but in the US, certainly, not that familiar recently.
Well, the state certainly intervenes to take away those free meals. Like, I think we have a kind of free meal program in the United States that gets degraded year after year.
Yeah.
We'll talk a bit more about your conception of how this is going to happen towards the end. Do you want to take the next question, Jamie?
Yeah. So I'm wondering about your use of the term luxury, because I think Andy and I both admire the optimism of your vision. It gets away from the kind of austere bunker communism or back to the land or primitivism that we've seen from other communist thinkers that just is not going to get that many people on board. But at the same time, I wonder if luxury is the appropriate framing here, because to me that word signifies a kind of status relative to other people and excess that I think we need to get away from in the post-capitalist future. I also wonder about the need for degrowth if we're going to solve the climate crisis, although maybe that's what the asteroids are for. But just like the idea that we wouldn't need to give up anything at all in order to make communism, especially here in the first world, and that we wouldn't need to make any changes that anyone would define as a sacrifice. Like, I wonder if that's responsible or realistic. Like, I would love to get rid of cars and just build high-speed train lines everywhere. But there are people who would feel that as a loss, just like ramping down meat production. Although, again, it sounds like we have taken care of that with lab meat.
You know, it's a really good question. So I obviously believe there should be significant constraints on the total autonomy of individuals to behave as they wish. So I'm not a market libertarian, right? I believe in those constraints. The idea of luxury communism doesn't mean that everybody can have as much of everything as they like. What it means, at least for me, part of it, what it means is firstly ideas of communal luxury. So if you look at, for instance, in 1952, now bear in mind, Britain was involved in a horrific war, Second World War, as was the United States. But obviously, there was destruction of fixed capital here, of factories, of the Blitz, and so on. 1952, and your listeners can listen to Google this. There's an estate in central London called the Golden Lane Estate. It's built in 1952, and it had a swimming pool, had tennis courts, had a nursery, had a badminton court. And it was available. It was social council housing. It was available to Londoners. Today, a room in the Golden Lane Estate in central London, a room is £1,000 a month. Oh, OK, and that swimming pool is still there and it's still glorious, but it's not working class Londoners that are using it. Another example, the Festival of Britain. Anybody that's been to London will have gone to the South Bank, will have seen the Royal Festival Hall all around there. It's great. I think it's the nicest public space in London. It was built in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, like I say, with the Festival of Britain. And this was done in a far more degraded economy than what we're presently facing. Or you could go even further back. There are Lidos in Britain, outdoor swimming pools. There's a beautiful one in Penzance. If your listeners could Google it. Britain outdoor Lidos, Lido, Penzance, Saltdean near Brighton, Saltdean, Hackney Lido. These were glorious sort of public pools, right? And this is the 1930s. So the equivalent today would be like every small town, all municipalities having the equivalent of like a heated infinity pool. The technology is, that's 80 years ago and we were doing that. So I think for me, that word luxury is important for a few reasons. Firstly, the idea that we can't do that is an effective ideology. The idea that we can't do that. If in 1952 Britain could have council housing with swimming pools and tennis courts for people, surely we can have something quite similar 60 years later. And I think the claim that we can't is an ideological claim, and it's the left taking contemporary capitalism's claims and its truth at its word. And that's not true. And we need to see through that ideology. So that's why I like the word luxury. Again, look at in Russia. And this is obviously not a social democratic context. It's in the USSR, it's a communist or a state socialist context. They created cultural palaces very quickly after the revolution. And there's an account of an American, I can't remember his name now, but he goes to Russia in the early 1920s. He goes to St. Petersburg, he goes to Moscow, and he says these recreational facilities available to ordinary people are far better than anything in the United States. Why was that? It was because, people decided to deploy resources, land, labor, capital in a different way. Or the Moscow Underground. Very opulent. You might think it's in bad taste. You might think it's garish. But clearly that idea of, there's nothing too good for the working class. That's not a particularly new idea. And it's something I'm really trying to rehabilitate. And I think it's very important because it's actually true. It's actually true. The idea that luxury flats right now are actually luxurious is patently absurd. They're ridiculous. They're not built to the same standard as what council housing was 60 years ago in this country. So it's an ideological claim, and I don't think that's true. So I want to reclaim that idea of luxury, not necessarily as surplus, a surplus of time for sure, but not necessarily as extravagance or being better than anybody else. Something, an infinitely infinitely better quality of living than we presently do. Because the idea that we presently have a high quality of living in our societies, people on median incomes, is ridiculous. I think, and I think in 20 to 30 years' time, people will look back on it just as we look back on the final decades of the DDR and East Germany. People say, "Wow, they had that amazing technology available to them. They had such incredible possibilities, and they thought this was as good as it gets."
Yeah. I mean, I guess it could also involve a redefinition of luxury, because for a lot of people, free time is a luxury. Control over your life is a luxury. I mean, it should be normal, but it's not. So maybe that could fit into there somehow.
Yeah, and to me, the concept of luxury is bound in with this idea of just waste, of just, spending money for the sake of it, buying something that's far too expensive, like a purse that costs $10,000 for some reason. But what you're talking about is having the good things that could theoretically be available to everyone if it wasn't for the market keeping it from them.
Yeah, and I there is a really strong left tradition on this stuff. So even like the Paris Commune, there were a number of leading artists involved in the Paris Commune. When William Morris looks at this across the channel, it really influenced his thinking. The idea that you could have artists engaged in sort of political struggle. You could view this almost as, you look at the German ideology about, hunting in the morning, or, being a literary critic in the evening. And so all of a sudden, an artist is not somebody whose social function is to create art. An artist is somebody who is a person who, among other things, creates art. And so I think I want to situate luxury within that same understanding, right? Luxury is not serving a social function, in upholding or expressing conspicuous consumption. Clearly, luxury under a new set of social relations means something quite different. It means happiness, it means joy, but it also. But again, we're Marxists, right? Because those aren't we're not Hegelians. Those aren't abstract, intellectual or metaphysical or purely mental, spiritual states of mind. That emerges, that happiness, that joy, that contentness comes from material reality, which, that does necessitate, free childcare for all, fantastic, large, flats in the center of town for everybody, commodious, large, enjoyable, pleasurable forms of public transportation. So I would happily call that luxurious, and it's certainly better than the luxury on offer from contemporary capitalism to 99% of people.
Well, one sort of follow-up, playing a primitivist advocate, I guess. So one thing I think about with foodie culture, for example, and I am a bit of a reluctant foodie myself, as you might have been able to tell by my enthusiasm for the Impossible Burger,
is that dumpsters?
Sure. I'm a very particular kind of foodie in that regard. Like, I think what a lot of people are searching for when they're, go to these like food fairs, these new conceptual restaurants and try these special dishes and stuff is a kind of authenticity, or, novelty, but also authenticity. They want to try food from around the world. They want to, eat in different ways. They want, new tastes and new experiences. But I think they also want something that can't be provided, that you can't buy, which is they want the authenticity and like really the love that comes from like a home cooked meal or a meal shared with friends, something that you just can't really get from the market. And I wonder if some of the luxury that you're talking about, some of the necessities and services that are being provided, although it's as long as there's a state with these mass surpluses of wealth and stockpiles of wealth, it should be provided to the people. But there's still going to be this level of alienation so long as it's just this objective process of redistribution of wealth.
So go on. Sort of ask me substantively. I understand what you mean, but so ask me a question in regards to how that relates to FALC.
I guess the good life that we're talking about, like, it can be theoretically right now, and which has been true for at least 100 years, like theoretically this good life can be provided to the masses through a just redistribution of wealth. But is that really a good life, and is that really communism? Are
you saying that these things will be as toys given to children with no understanding of where they come from, Andy?
Well, I think people understand where they come from. They just, there needs to be a subjective element to this. That's kind of where I'm working towards.
So I'd agree with you that probably since, let's say, I probably since the early 20th century, we could have just reordered society in such a way as to have what Marx sort of understood as socialism, right? I think for most of the world, I think that's a pretty fair thing. So you don't even need the new mode of production. You just need to change how workers relate to how they create value. And pretty much everyone everywhere can have a nice standard of living. And I would agree with that. And I would say socialism, and that's why I make a distinction between socialism and communism. Socialism has always been possible. Socialism is always possible because all it is about reorienting and changing and transforming relationships within capitalism. I think communism is now possible, whereas it wasn't 100 years ago, because of changes in the sort of technological base relating to the third disruption. Mm-hmm. So I don't disagree with that. What I would say, though, is the World Health Organization by 2030 expects depression to be the global sort of the leading health burden globally. So clearly something is, and look, people have always been unhappy. You've got medieval or early modern writers talking about melancholia, et cetera, et cetera. But clearly something strange is happening where it's becoming such a prominent, integral part of mass social life. Clearly something strange is happening. And so I don't think that under communism, people will still cheat sometimes on their lover. They have a falling out with their friend, or they have a row with the family, etc. But what would be different under socialism is that let's start with socialism. Everybody has access to the resources by which they can alter their own lives, right? So I would say that liberal ends, the idea that we're all uniquely capable of determining who we want to be, are impossible without socialist means. So that's the big difference. And I don't think socialism is a place where there's an absence of pain or of unhappiness or of, suffering. But it's a different political ordering of society. Just as, under feudalism, I'm sure there were plenty of people who were happy and there were plenty of people who were unhappy. Or even, before the first disruption, before we have recorded human history, before the agricultural revolution, I'm sure there were some very happy hunter-gatherers and some very, unhappy ones. But generally speaking, if you were to ask me, would I like to have been born in a world with anesthetic, with hot water, with electricity? I mean, I'm pretty happy to have been born when I am, generally speaking, yeah. I probably would have been liked to have born maybe 30 years earlier, but generally speaking, I'm pretty happy with it. So the idea of, I don't necessarily know how quote unquote authenticity relates to communism. But what I would say is that clearly the social relations which emerge out of late capitalism are leading to, significant amounts of inauthenticity. The book is concerned really about economic and technological change, and because I'm a Marxist, I would say that the forms of social consciousness emerge from that. It's building on strong foundations. So, although I'm not just a technological and economic determinist, of course. It's an important question, but I think it's an adjacent one.
Well, I think the point that you've made super well in the book, and I don't think, having read a few criticisms of it, I don't think people give you quite enough credit for this, is that you recognize the incredible amount of the way technology and the social order can change very rapidly in a situation of like war, for instance. Yeah. Like, for example, I was reading on the creation of nuclear weapons, and this was something that was theoretically possible for decades, and physicists had talked about it, and it took the start of World War II to get all those people together for the Manhattan Project, and they made it happen pretty quickly. Yeah. And that's just one example. Like I read somewhere that you could be trained to be a doctor within 1 year in the United States because there was a shortage of doctors. So we have the ability to do these things that so far only like war and crisis and rebuilding after war has allowed us to happen. And now we're facing this different sort of crisis, which is not going to be this immediate war, hopefully not, but this like slow decline into climate catastrophe. I have the intuition that there's not going to be a state solution to this problem. This is something that's going to call for a grassroots social reorganization. I'm not totally wedded to that idea, but I don't see how this automation that you're talking about is just going to naturally happen. I think it needs to be capital needs to be pushed towards that automation. And even then, I'm worried that automation is just going to be this kind of mystical objective force.
Of course. I mean, so in the book, I talk about how does history how does history work? How does it unfold? How do things change? And I talk about the historical process as being an ensemble of separate fields. So social relations, relations to nature, technology, forms of daily life. And my argument is that each political tradition historically has privileged one of these spaces or spheres to the detriment of the rest. So a technological determinist or Elon Musk would say we just need to change technology, the rest will look after itself. He's wrong. A deep green would say we just need to relate to nature in a different way, forget productive processes, forget organized labor, forget about how we relate to humans. We just need to think about how we relate to nature and change that. An anarchist, obviously I'm offering a pastiche of how these traditions work, but I'm offering an archetype to make the point. An anarchist might say we just need to focus on everyday social relations, and then everything else will sort itself out. We don't need to work around how do we create new technologies to adapt or mitigate the crises of the 21st century. Marxist-Leninists would say we just need to change relations to the means of production rather than working out how we create new technologies. A great example is the Soviet Union, the creation of the Soviet Union with Leninism. The Bolsheviks were huge fans of Taylorism. They wanted to accelerate the development of the USSR, and they were looking at how American capitalism was alienating value from American workers, and they wanted to imitate it. So there's that ensemble of different things you need to look at, and technology clearly is just one part of it. We do need new relationships to nature. We do need new social relations. We do need mental conceptions, new forms of daily life, which is why the book is called Communism. Otherwise I would just call it The Future of Technology. Because I want to couple these technological changes to a broader political project. We do need to relate to nature in such a way that we don't view it as distinct from humanity. Mm-hmm. We do certainly need to stop eating animals. We certainly need to view ourselves as part of a sort of globally connected species. We certainly need to understand that human civilization is subordinate to global climate systems. All of these things matter. But my point is, if you're looking at the possibilities for a socialist project in the 21st century, the technologies alighted upon are really important, because we don't just have to. It's not just a question of do things get better or do things stay the same because of these technologies. Either things get better or things get worse. And I think there's a great book by a chap called Peter Frazee, Four Futures. He talks about that very well. Because these technologies create new vistas for surveillance, exploitation, alienation, immiseration. Or they allow the possibility for something else. So I'm certainly not a technological determinist. But I think, like I say, if I'm trying to do anything with this book, and it's, obviously I believe every word I've written, but at the very least, I would want it to be a provocation to people to say, reinvestigate certainly ideas of luxury, and how it relates to capitalism, and to what extent do you view the limits of possibility as, or to what extent should you view the limits of political possibility actually as capitalist ideology? And actually the facts aren't facts, they're just politically contingent, and they suit certain interests. And also, how should we relate to technology? And the investigation of the technologies is investigating them in the here and now. I'm giving case studies about what's happening already. A dog breeder, David Ishii, applying to the FDA in 2017, saying he wants to edit the genome of his Dalmatians to get rid of the gout that they all suffer from. FDA press release a few weeks later saying we're going to treat edited genome data as equivalent to a patented pharmaceutical drug. There's a reason they've done that. And so the battle for us, for people who care about, well, how do we ensure that people in the future don't have sickle cell anemia, cystic fibrosis, Huntington's, Parkinson's, that's the technology. Now you can say, well, you're a technological determinist. No, I'm not, because in Britain with the NHS, we're going to benefit from those technologies. In the United States, where you don't have the NHS, you won't. And that difference is a political one. But talking about the technological possibility is a way of opening up that political conversation, and how about certain things which are presented to us as inevitable aren't their political choices.
Are you saying we need to risk the imagination of a new kind of possibility?
We do. Well, you know what? I'm gutted I've already printed the book because that wasn't in there. But, that would have been good. That should have been the opening line.
Little nugget for all you Schultz heads out there.
That's from Peanuts?
Oh, yeah. It's from when, what's his name? The Peanuts guy, he ran for president. It was really stupid.
Howard Schultz.
Oh, Howard Schultz. Oh,
yeah,
okay. I thought you were talking about the Charlie Brown guy.
No, that would be funny, though.
I think Kamala Harris is even worse than him, though, isn't she?
They're
he
both
was pretty bad.
I think he was worse. Yeah, I got to say that.
Yeah.
The thing she said the other day, though, I was watching it. What was it? I watched my colleague at Novara tweeted it, Michael Walker, and she was just stumped. What was it? And it was just kind of on the spot question. Her response. I mean, I thought it was as bad as Howard Schultz, but maybe that was just like maybe she only slept 3 hours. On the spot.
I mean,
she was bad.
At her worst, she's probably as bad as Howard Schultz. At her best, she's better than Howard Schultz. So, one of our favorite subjects here at the Antifada is praxis. And I want to talk about it. So, you have a quote here. This is not a book about the future, but about a present that goes unacknowledged. The outline of a world immeasurably better than our own, more equal, prosperous, and creative, is there to see if only we dare to look. But insight alone is not enough. We must have the courage, for that is what is required to argue, persuade, and build. Now, I think the missing step in the way a lot of people talk about these things is expropriation. And I'm glad that you gave some credit to the Marxist-Leninists who probably focus on that to the exclusion of everything else, the need to change the relations of production and expropriate the world that we built, really, the world that is ours, despite having been stolen from us. But here it sounds kind of like almost some like we just need to persuade on the marketplace of ideas, which is, I think, demonstrably not ever going to be enough to cause the kind of power shift and total paradigm shift that we're going to need to make it happen. So what would you say about the primacy of class struggle and the need to expropriate above all else? Because like the primary obstacles, as I see them here, are political.
Yeah, so I agree with expropriation. I mean, there are obviously instances of expropriation where it's not as it doesn't look like it did under, there is instances, for instance, post-war social democracy did certain amounts of expropriation. The point was the political framework within which it happened, as history tells us, was that was pretty temporary. You see something quite similar with the Meidner plan in Sweden. That would have been a radical expropriation of wealth from the capitalist class. It doesn't work. And I think that's a really important thing to hold on to. It doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? Because it doesn't command, the ideas don't command enough hegemony within the Swedish working class more generally. And I think that's really, really important. So in the UK, and I'll clarify what the Meidner plan is. In the UK, we're doing something quite similar at the moment. Bernie's also talking about it. The idea that workers will own a percentage of the businesses that they work for. Labour and John McDonnell are talking about this. The FTSE 250, the 250 most valuable companies on the UK stock exchange would have to give, I think, 10% of equity over to workers, and it will sort of gradually grow, right? And we can have a conversation around how much it would be, right? Obviously, the more radical you are, the higher you want it to go. But this policy has caused consternation for the capitalist media. The FT had a front page about it a few days ago. I remember talking to economists last summer when it first came out, and they were so angry because they said, look, we can deal with putting the tax rate up slightly. We can deal with an estates tax. We can deal with, using these tools. But what this policy represents is fundamentally infringing private property rights. And that's true. That's absolutely correct. That's exactly what it was. So, I think we do need to understand expropriation within a broader term. It can mean the seizure of certain state businesses, which I'm, in certain contexts, I'm perfectly happy to do. If there's a no deal Brexit and we can't create pharmaceutical drugs for everybody, we need to obviously nationalize GlaxoSmithKline and put it under public ownership and create the drugs that people need in this country. I'm perfectly happy to do that. But in terms of what Labour should be arguing for in the next general election, bringing BAE Systems, it's a weapons manufacturer, bringing that into public ownership. They have 20,000 engineers using them to create technologies that will actually solve problems rather than create them. And then the stuff like the Workers' Ownership Fund. So expropriation absolutely matters, but it doesn't need to. Again, let's try and challenge some of the assumptions we've got from the early 20th century about what that necessarily looks like. And then about persuasion, we do need to persuade because those ideas as was the case with the Minder plan, which didn't work in Sweden, they're not hegemonic amongst working people. So persuasion is clearly a necessary precursor. I'm not saying we need to persuade Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, and we probably agree on this, because they have fundamentally different material interests to the rest of us. But we clearly do need to persuade people who share our material interests. We can't just presume that because they share our material interests that we can circumvent that or ignore it. If we could, then obviously the revolution already would have happened. So I think persuasion is absolutely necessary. And, that's the critical question of the left the last 150 years, since the 1848 revolutions or since the Paris Commune, is the question of organization. We can take the world back. It's very simple to do if only we found the right organizational model by which to do it. And I think the question of persuasion can't be viewed as detached from the question of organization. Bolshevik Revolution, very successful, had its own organs for popular persuasion. You can look at post-war social democratic parties. You can look at, for instance, the DSA. That's an organizational form which is trying to persuade sections of the working class to achieve a certain political agenda. So, yeah, persuasion matters. But clearly, I'm not trying to persuade people who have different material interests to working class people.
So obviously, you're a big supporter of Corbyn. That's a lot of what's interesting about Novara is you seem to be a part of this movement to literally take power in England in a short period of time. Do you see that? Like, are you wedded to any one way of coming into power? Are you purely a parliamentarian, or do you think that different methods could work in different places? I'm just wondering how is it that we're going to take control of the technology and the economy and the state in order to do some of the things that you talk about?
Yeah, so I think you do need control of the state to do the things we're talking about. Ultimately, you could have access to just certain apparatus of the state, which is obviously preferable. If you could have radical socialists who are in charge of 100 American cities, that's great. I'm not going to say it's a bad thing. But ideally, you'd want control of Congress, the federal government. You'd want workers being highly organized with high union trade density, being represented at the highest levels of government as well. I can only really answer, I suppose, in terms of the British context. Mm-hmm. And I would a short response would be, yeah, of course, it's context specific. The appropriate organizational persuasion response is different in Britain or Sweden or the US. In Britain, and through Labour, Labour has failed as an instrument of implementing socialism for 100 years. At least with the Democratic Party, that was never its mission. Whereas with Labour, that's historically been its mission, is socialism. Explicitly, Clause 4 was gotten rid of by Blair in the early 90s. But even, the Attlee governments and so on in the immediately following the Second World War didn't really live up to that. So, and why was that? It was because Labour was a parliamentary socialist party rather than a party of socialists in Parliament. What does that mean? It means that their sort of binding fidelity was to the parliamentary system, rather than representing party members and constituents to achieve certain socialist policies. So this is why you see this huge outcry in recent years over mandatory selection. This is why you see this huge hostility by the British media and press to a mass membership Labour Party, because they want Labour to remain a primarily parliamentary party, i.e. It's transfixed by the allure of the House of Commons. That's why all that Gothic wealth is there, neo-Gothic wealth, Gothic revival wealth is there, all these paintings, all the gold leaf. It's to make people feel that they are part of that institution rather than being representatives of working class people. So the first answer to the question is you have to transform the Labour Party from being a parliamentary party to a party of socialists in Parliament. That's why I back mandatory selection. That's why I back a radical democratisation of the Labour Party. I would want several million people to be members of the Labour Party in Britain. Why? Because, there's been a great debate about political education in Labour. And often it's viewed as let's have classes to teach people what to think. And yeah, that's great. Let's do that. Fine. But the act of creating a democratic party itself is educational. The act of running for a branch secretary or a LGBT officer or a BAME officer or running as a councillor, those actions then create new possibilities and mindsets for working class people, and that activity should be understood as a precursor for those people then doing the exact same things within the state. It's almost like prefiguring how working class people can run the state. You have to democratize and run a mass member party. So that's how I understand we would do it in Britain. Clearly in the US, it's quite different. You know, you have a presidential system. It's not such it's not nowhere near as centralized. You have a federal, you have a federal system. You have 50 federal states. In Britain, if anything, our job's quite easy. You know, you can win a government majority, you can transform the BBC, you can transform the NHS, you can transform the British Army. You know, all the major multinationals are based in London, basically. So, yeah, our job is much easier than yours, I think. But then at the same time, the prize on offer for socialists in the United States, if you get it right there, then obviously that's world historic.
Yeah. I mean, we're all very excited about the rising tide of left populism in the world, I think, right now. We all support Bernie Sanders. We're excited about Jeremy Corbyn. At the same time, the jump from that to global, some kind of stateless, classless, communist society is still going to be enormous. And I'm just wondering what you think the next step is after that, because we've seen in the past, social democracy is not going to last. It's not going to cut it. I'm not convinced that it would last as long as it did the last time, given the current conditions of our global financialized market and the way that it's developing. So, what do you see as the next step there?
Yeah, so I mean, the final third of the book, and of course it's huge. So, some people might be agreeing with me on something. They might be saying, I agree with his analysis of the Labour Party, but what the hell does that have to do with synthetic meat and, AI? The final third of the book tries to kind of bring that together, which is policies which can be implemented, policies which should be pursued by parties within the contemporary terrain to radically change economies and to sort of move us towards these things. So let me give you a few examples. The first is we need to socialize finance, which is basically the aspect of credit creation should no longer be entirely subordinated to profit-seeking companies, but rather to things which create social value. A great example, and obviously if I say that on the BBC, people go, that's crazy. Somebody from the CBI, the Confederation of British Industry, will say, you're mad. But I'll give you an example, which is just really again, how ideological that presumption is. In 2000, I think 7-8, Cadbury was bought by Kraft. Cadbury produces chocolate in the UK. The bank which financed it was RBS. And as you're probably aware, RBS was at that time owned by the British taxpayer. Once Cadbury had been purchased by Kraft, Kraft moved most of its tax base to Switzerland. It laid off workers and it increased the amount of sugar in the chocolate so that the public health outcomes were inferior. So the taxpayer basically gave £7 billion worth of credit to Kraft to do this, to lose jobs, to create bigger public health issues and to have a smaller tax base. And so for me, that's completely ridiculous. And so we need to socialize finance to do something which would be inverted to that. We want to finance certain projects which can have socially advantageous rather than disadvantageous ends. That's the first one. Then I talk about the Preston model. You have something similar in the US called the Cleveland model. It's actually originally the Cleveland model. How we can relocalize economies, how we can grow the worker and cooperatively owned economies, how we can reduce regional inequality. And I think it's not often talked about enough. Regional inequality is, I think, the major reason why we have Brexit. It's the major reason why we have the rise of Donald Trump. I mean, patently. If you look at venture capital in the US, I think 50% of it alone goes to California. Right now, I have no interest in reordering where venture capital goes in the United States, but that does show you where economic opportunities are in the country. And why certain places are left behind and being neglected. And then the third part is universal basic services, UBS. And I hold this in counterpoint to UBI. And I say that housing, healthcare, education, information, transport should be taken out of commodity circulation, shouldn't be sold for profit, because these are human rights, they're prerequisites for living decent lives. We talked about a bit earlier about having access to resources to live meaningful lives, that these shouldn't be subject to profit and exchange value. And I think those three things done at the level of the nation state, and we can talk about this a bit more because you talked about a stateless, classless global communism. Clearly in the sort of intervening period, this is done through democratically accountable or with democratically accountable nation states. And that takes us somewhere else. Now, Karl Marx talking about communism, and we've already established communism isn't socialism. We could probably agree on what socialism would look like, whether it's in one country or not. Karl Marx says, I'm not here to write recipes for the cookshops of the future. And to an extent, that's how we do need to understand communism, right? It's like me being somebody before the steam engine and trying to envisage what capitalism would look like, or post-feudalism would look like. I wouldn't even call it capitalism. I'd say it's feudalism, post-feudalism. And so do we have to have a blueprint for a stateless, classless, global communism? No. Is that possible? I would argue not. Mm-hmm. Can we create a minimal program in the here and now for radical social democracy leading to an even more radical form of socialism? Yes. Should it be conducted on the lines of sovereign nation states? Yes. Should it be internationalist? Absolutely, because all the crises it's trying to mitigate are definitely internationalist. And I know that's not the perfect answer, but honestly, I think it's the best one I'll ever come up with.
Yeah, I think you're reading your book, and also some of the work by Christian Parenti recently about the Green New Deal. It's actually something that it's kind of an antidote to how bleak the political situation is, where there's like the Green New Deal that Sanders and Cortez have proposed. It's not too far off from what Parenti's talking about. So there's kind of like this silver lining to how horrible things are. But I'm also, as a revolutionary communist, I try to steer, be somewhat critical of that kind of pragmatism. And so one critique of the Green New Deal that we've talked a lot about in the United States is from Jasper Burns in Commune magazine. And I know you had something of a response to this with Fully Automated Green Communism, a piece in Novara Media. And then another critique of your schema and the Green New Deal schema in general is it's this kind of Marxist Keynesianism. And I think you kind of, in a way, own that in the book, which is interesting. But I don't know if those are too far apart critiques for you to respond to at once, but I just wanted to throw those out there.
The Marxist Keynesianism thing is a really important point. And this is where I have a sort of disagreement with my colleague, Michael Walker. He would call himself a class war social democrat, and that's his politics, right? Mm-hmm. Which is to say that he's a social democrat, but he understands that the gains of social democracy can never be sort of presumed. And that you constantly need very militant worker organizing. You want to have things that social democrats never really historically liked, close shop, etc. He would, that's what he would say. I would say, as somebody who's view myself as a communist, there's another mode of production beyond this one, and that actually, over time we should obviously minimize market interactions. Now, the point about Marxist Keynesianism, which I would think that fits with Michael Walker's politics. I think it's premised on, and this is the shortcoming of social democracy really over the last 40 years. It's premised on eternal compound growth. So we will have forever 2% plus GDP growth. That will mean we have a growing economy which pays for the tax receipts to do X, Y, Z, right? Whether it's and tuition fees, college fees, whether it's transitioning beyond fossil fuels, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think that's possible. And I don't think under capitalism, particularly in terms of how we relate to the planet's resources, that's possible. And so we need to reorder social relations in such a way that I don't think you could call it Keynesian. Keynesianism would look at the planet. It would say, these are the resources. We need to use these resources in order to create capitalist growth, which will then be used to fund social welfare programs, etc. I don't say that. What's more, FALC isn't distributivist. It's not saying let's help. And again, it's that social democratic presumption, which we probably agree is not correct, which is let's help business be as successful as possible. We'll tax them so that the dividend of that goes back to working people. UBS isn't saying that. Universal Basic Services is not saying that. If you're a landlord and you're currently getting profit from rent, game over. Right. If you're a shareholder in a company which owns a bus company or a rail operator in this country, game over. Same in outsourcing with healthcare, same with information, so internet, same with education in terms of higher education. Obviously, fortunately, still most public education here is provided by the state. So I wouldn't call that Keynesian. Is there still a significant part of the economy which is not really being brought under quite significant state control? Yeah, there is. because, as I talk about in the rest of the book, we want to expand what isn't covered by UBS through worker ownership gradually, through socializing finance and through the Preston model. But I wouldn't call that Keynesianism, because there's not a deference to private enterprise and private ownership and firms like you would find in Keynes historically, I think.
That's a very good distinction to make, and I think a super interesting way of thinking about it. I think we're almost out of time, unfortunately, but it was super good to speak with you and read your book. I'm super excited to spread the FALC gospel to everyone I know.
Oh, well, I hope I can come over to the States sometime and catch up face to face, because what you guys are doing over there is inspiring for us as well.
Oh my God! Thank you so much. We love Novara Media,
right?
Well, no, the whole thing. Well, no, it's a similar vibe to the UK, right? Because you've got left politicians, but there is clearly this emerging left media ecology, which is working. So yeah, which includes
working,
the
and it's very exciting to reference a drop that we use on the Majority Report, because my brain is broken by my job that I do 4 days a week.
By all the high level ideas.
Yeah,
it takes a while to recover.
Oh my God, tell me about it. So, do you have anything that you would like to plug before we go?
Well, other than the book, I guess there's Novara Media, novaramedia.com. We're trying to